So tonight we'll be looking at the Kosambiya Sutta, which is the 48th sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya, the discourse at Kosambi. So this comes from a particular time when there was a argument going on between two groups of monks at Kosambi. Thus have I heard. On one occasion, the Blessed One was dwelling at Kosambi in Gosita's park. On this occasion, the monks at Kosambi were engaged in disputes, arguments, and contention. They were verbally assaulting each other. They could not persuade each other, and they were not persuaded by each other. They could not convince each other, and they were not convinced by each other. In other words, it was a thoroughly unproductive argument. Then a certain monk approached the Blessed One, venerated him, and sat down to one side. When he was seated to one side, that monk said to the Blessed One, "Here, Bhante, the monks at Kosambi are engaged in disputes, arguments, and contention. They are verbally assaulting each other. They cannot persuade each other, and they are not persuaded by each other. They cannot convince each other, and they are not convinced by each other." Then the Blessed One addressed a certain monk. "Monk, go and summon those monks with my words. The teacher summons you." "Yes, Bhante," that monk replied to the Blessed One. He approached the monks and said to them, "The teacher summons you." "Yes, Venerable," those monks replied to that monk. They approached the Blessed One, venerated him, and sat to one side. When they were seated to one side, the Blessed One said to those monks, "Monks, is it true that you are engaged in disputes, arguments, contention, and mutual verbal assault? Is it true that you cannot persuade each other and are not persuaded by each other, that you cannot convince each other and are not convinced by each other?" "Yes, Bhante." "Monks, what do you think? When you are engaged in disputes, arguments, contention, and mutual verbal assault, have physical actions, verbal actions, and mental actions based on loving kindness been established in regard to your co-practitioners, both publicly and privately?" "Certainly not, Bhante." So this is one of the first basic principles that the Buddha is pointing to here, before he even gets into the list of elements of communal harmony. He's pointing to here this simple thing of maintaining an attitude of loving kindness in what we do, what we say, and even in what we think. So we started this session with a period of loving kindness meditation. So it's establishing that attitude in the mind, that genuine attitude of benevolence and goodwill, of wishing for each other to be happy, healthy, and safe. So when we start with that attitude of mind, then we will speak accordingly. We will speak kindly, gently, courteously, in a way meant to help the people around us be happy, healthy, and safe. And we'll also act accordingly. So we'll act with an attitude of loving kindness, which means that we will do things that help the people around us be happy, healthy, and safe. So this is a very basic principle of living together in harmony, of getting along well together. It's establishing that basic mental attitude of loving kindness and making every action we take be based on it. And in particular, the Buddha says here, both publicly and privately. So it's not like out in public you pretend to be nice to everyone, but then in private you're talking about how much you hate them and how much you want them to get hit by a car or something. But it's like all the time, no matter where you are or what the situation is, always maintaining a mind of loving kindness and basing our actions and speech on that attitude. So the Buddha continues, "Thus, monks, it is apparent that when you are engaged in disputes, arguments, contention, and mutual verbal assault, then physical actions, verbal actions, and mental actions based on loving kindness have not been established in regard to your co-practitioners, both publicly and privately. Foolish men, what could you possibly know or see that leads you to engage in disputes, arguments, contention, and mutual verbal assault, such that you cannot persuade each other and are not persuaded by each other, that you cannot convince each other and are not convinced by each other? Foolish men, this will lead to your long-lasting detriment and suffering." Um, so he's making it pretty clear here that there's really not any value in engaging in disputes, in engaging in this kind of unproductive argument. So there is value in discussion, but the important thing in discussion is to make a genuine effort to understand the other person's position. So instead of just trying to convince them that you are right, really make an effort to understand, how do they feel and why do they feel that way? What are they thinking and why are they thinking that? How do they see this issue? So really trying to see it from a well-rounded perspective. So rather than just saying, I'm right, you're wrong, end of story, really making an effort to see, well, this is how I see it, but how do you see it? What's your experience of this issue? And then we can come to a mutual understanding. But if we're just caught in this attitude, I'm right, you're wrong, and then in particular from a basis of that, we get into verbal assault. So that's another element of this, is that the monks at Kosambiya were not having a friendly discussion. It says they were engaging in mutual verbal assault. The word that's actually used is verbal daggers. That would be a more literal translation. So some translators translate this as stabbing each other with verbal daggers, which gives a more evocative image of what's going on here. So that's not productive. And not only is it not productive in terms of an effective discussion, but it also undermines our progress on the spiritual path, which is ultimately what matters most. So then the Buddha continues. Then the Blessed One addressed the monks. Monks, these 6 things are polite, create affection and respect, and lead to inclusiveness, non-contention, harmony, and unity. What 6? Here, monks, a monk establishes physical actions based on loving kindness in regard to his co-practitioners, both publicly and privately. This is one thing that is polite, creates affection and respect, and leads to inclusiveness, non-contention, harmony, and unity. Monks, this is another one. A monk establishes verbal actions based on loving kindness. Then the third one establishes mental actions based on loving kindness in regard to his co-practitioners, both publicly and privately. This is another thing that is polite, creates affection and respect, and leads to inclusiveness, non-contention, harmony, and unity. So this is really underlying the importance of basing all of our decisions on loving kindness. Basing all of our decisions on that pure-hearted wish. May everyone be happy. It's really hard to go wrong when you start with that attitude of mind. And the Buddha says this is something that creates affection and respect and leads to inclusiveness, non-contention, harmony, and unity. So whenever we're dealing with others, these are the kinds of qualities of that relationship that we want to strive for. So we want to strive for an attitude, an atmosphere of mutual affection, respect, inclusiveness, non-contention, harmony, and unity. Make sense? Okay, that sound good to anyone? Okay. So then the next 3 qualities, the Buddha says, monks, this is another one. A monk unreservedly shares with his virtuous co-practitioners any possessions he has acquired properly, even the contents of his alms bowl. This is another thing that is polite, creates affection and respect, and leads to inclusiveness, non-contention, harmony, and unity. So sharing what you have with your companions. This is something which, again, it creates an atmosphere of mutual affection, mutual appreciation. It's really noticeable. What do you feel like when somebody gives you a gift, when they share something with you? How does that feel? It feels really good, doesn't it? And it gives you a sense of appreciation for that person. It makes you want to be kinder to that person. It makes you want to be welcoming and accepting of that person. And then similarly, when we give a gift to others, how does that feel for us? there's a sense of joy, a sense of delight, that we're able to brighten somebody else's life, that we're able to bring joy to another person, that we're able to make things a little bit easier for another person. So a few key things here in what the Buddha says. First off, unreservedly. So one shares without reservation. So not holding back. So often we get in this kind of stingy attitude of like, yeah, well, it's mine. It's mine. I don't want to share it because it's mine. It's not yours. Well, what is that? That's stinginess. That's not generosity. There's no kindness there. There's just selfishness. So it's sharing without reservation. Another key element here is he says, possessions that one has acquired properly. In other words, not stealing things or acquiring things through dishonesty or through inappropriate methods, but rather seeking to acquire what we have through honest, fair approaches. And then what we do acquire in that appropriate, honest way, then we share with those around us. And the third major element here is, he says, even the contents of one's alms bowl. So that, of course, sounds like it's referring specifically to monastics. So monastics traditionally are alms mendicants. So we would take our bowl and walk through town, and whatever food people put in our bowl, that's what we have to eat for the day. And this practice is still done in many monasteries, both in Asia and also in the Western world. In many monasteries, you'll see the monastics, in the morning, they take their bowls and they go out and collect food for the day. And often it's not very much, or often it's not quite what you want. I remember one time I went on alms round and all I got was a block of cheese and some tomatoes. And it's like, well, okay, fair enough. I'll survive for another day. But even if that's all you have, then still be willing to share it with your companions. Still be willing to share it with your fellow practitioners. And again, this creates a real sense of mutual appreciation. It's like, this is my life here. This food that's been offered to me is my life, and I'm willing to share it with you because I recognize that you are just as valuable as me. So this is something that goes straight to the heart. There's another sutta where the Buddha says, if you understood the value of generosity as deeply as I do, then you would not eat even a single bite of food without sharing some of it with your companions. So that's something to reflect on. Every time you have a meal and you're about to take your first bite of food, reflect, have I made the effort to share with anybody else? If there's others around you, look and consider, is there something I could give? Could I share a little bit of this? Is there something I could do that would make life a little bit nicer for those around me? And it's actually something that people tend to appreciate very strongly. So gifts of food tend to have a profound emotional impact on people. So it's just an example. So the Buddha is talking about all possessions, but it's notable that he says even the contents of one's alms bowl. So even the food that you have for your next meal is something that's worth thinking about sharing with your companions. And then the sixth one, monks, this is another one. Oh, no, fifth one. Monks, this is another one. When living with one's co-practitioners, a monk engages both publicly and privately in virtuous behaviors which are unbroken, undamaged, unstained, unblemished, liberating, praised by the wise, free of grasping, and conducive to concentration. So this is maintaining basic principles of morality. So at a minimum, this is the 5 precepts. So not killing, not stealing, not cheating on your partner, not lying, and not using intoxicants. So the basic moral foundation of Buddhist practice, the basic principles of virtue. So it's recognizing that if we uphold for ourselves a high standard of moral conduct, then we will be blameless. And we are also much less likely to do anything that is offensive or harmful to others. So that helps to create a sense of mutual trust. Like if somebody knows that you are committed to not stealing, then if one of their possessions goes missing, they're not going to suspect you. It won't even cross their mind. They would just be like, well, but Sam has taken the precepts. There's no way Sam stole my bag. I must have lost it, or maybe somebody else took it, or maybe Sam borrowed it because he's a good friend of mine and he knows he can borrow my things if he needs to. But you would never once think Sam stole my stuff because you know that Sam does not steal. So in the same way, when we are thoroughly committed to virtue, then we become trustworthy. We give to others the gift of not needing to fear us. We give to others the gift of safety, a feeling of safety and security when they're around us. So you know that this person is not going to harm you. They're not going to rob you. They're not going to lie to you. And you know that since they don't use intoxicants, their mind is going to be relatively clear and stable. So it's a gift. There's another sutta where the Buddha says there are 5 great gifts you can give to the world. What 5? Not killing, not stealing, avoiding sexual misconduct, not telling lies, and not using intoxicants. These are the 5 great gifts you can give to the world. So, and it's also noting, so he says that these virtuous behaviors are liberating. So you might think, oh, well, there are restrictions. Like not killing means that I'm no longer free to kill. You might see it that way. But actually the feeling of it is liberation. We're free. What are we free from? We're free from remorse. We're free from regret. We're free from blame. We're free from the negative karmic consequences of such actions. We're free from the negative social consequences of such actions. And the mind becomes spacious because it's not caught in self-centeredness. So the mind is free of that trap of self-obsession. They're praised by the wise. They're free of grasping. So, like the mind of a thief, what's that coming from? It's coming from grasping. It's coming from a mind of acquisition, of trying to get things for yourself. So the practices of morality are an aspect of non-attachment, of renunciation, of letting go of the futile pursuit to find happiness in the outside world. And they're conducive to concentration. So when we have a strong moral foundation, the mind is free of regret, it's free of remorse. There's happiness and joy, which comes from positive self-regard. So the reflection, I am a good person, brings up a lot of joy in the mind. And joy is conducive to concentration. And the 6th one, the Buddha says, monks, this is another one. When living with one's co-practitioners, a monk maintains, both publicly and privately, a perspective which is noble, salvific, and correctly leads the maintainer of that perspective to the elimination of suffering. So this final one it's referring to our worldview. So how do we see the world? How do we think about the world? So it's seeking to develop right view, right perspective, which is the foundation of the Noble Eightfold Path. So this is a critical element right at the heart of the Buddha's teachings. And the linchpin of right view is karma, causality, cause and effect. It's the recognition that every single choice we make produces a corresponding consequence. A very simple example the Buddha gives is if you are generous, then the result is you will be wealthy. If you are stingy, the result is that you will be poor. So very simple. You get what you give. So this becomes very important in terms of developing the path to awakening. If we want to attain enlightenment, it's actually not that complicated. You just keep producing the causes that lead to the mind awakening. So a very simple example of this is developing mindfulness, equanimity, and concentration. Those are choices we make which make it easier for the mind to awaken. And helping others in their spiritual practice, then means that we ourselves will be helped in our own practice. So this is one of the basic principles behind the Bodhisattva ideal, the vow to help others attain awakening. Because when you give awakening to others, you will be the recipient of that same assistance. Others will help you on the path as well. So developing and maintaining right view. So other elements of right view are the recognition that all things are impermanent. There's nothing that is unchanging, stable, or eternal. All things are impersonal. Whatever you think you are, that's not it, because it can change. In fact, it does change. So these are basic principles of right view, which are critical to the development of the path towards awakening. And when one has a clear understanding of these principles, then naturally one will be very careful in how one relates to others, because you recognize that every single choice you make matters. Everything you do is important. So then one will be naturally very considerate. If one has right view, then one will be considerate of others as an expression of that right view. And so naturally one will make an effort to be harmonious with one's companions. One will make an effort to be non-contentious, to be mutually supportive, to be mutually respectful and kind with one's co-practitioners. So the Buddha continues, "Monks, these are 6 things that are polite, create affection and respect, and lead to inclusiveness, non-contention, harmony, and unity. Monks, of these 6 polite things, this is the best one, the all-inclusive one, the unifying one. The perspective which is noble, salvific, and correctly leads its maintainer to the elimination of suffering." So the reason why right view is brought forward as the best one, the all-inclusive one, the unifying one, is because when you have right view, you'll naturally also do the other 5 principles of communal harmony. Naturally, you'll act with loving kindness at all times because you understand that acting with the basis of loving kindness helps to establish the foundation for awakening. You'll understand that supporting your fellow practitioners means that you yourself will not lack in your basic needs. You understand that when you give food to others, you're establishing the conditions for you to never be lacking in food. So it's this understanding of the basic principle of causality. Every action has an equal and corresponding reaction. That's how karma works. Everything you do creates a corresponding reaction, corresponding result. So then the Buddha goes into talking about the 7 factors of stream entry. So 7 ways of discerning whether or not you have attained the first stage of enlightenment. I should warn you before I go through this list, odds are pretty good that nobody in this room has all 7 of these factors, including me, by the way. Just making that clear. So attaining stream entry is actually quite difficult. It takes a lot of effort, and generally speaking, it takes a lot of time, because it goes directly counter to our most deeply set mental habits, which are based on self-centeredness. So the attainment of stream entry, by its very nature, goes directly counter to self-centeredness. In fact, you could say that all of Buddhist practice is about one thing: overcoming self-centeredness. It's really it. That's all it is. That's why we have all these practices of generosity and kindness and compassion and all that. It's not just to be nice to people, though of course it's good to be nice to people. It's also because that erodes self-centeredness. And self-centeredness is at the heart of all of our suffering and delusion. So be nice to people. It'll help you attain enlightenment. Anyway, so 7 factors of stream entry. The Buddha says, monks, what is the perspective which is noble, salvific, and correctly leads its maintainer to the elimination of suffering? Here, monks, a monk has gone to the forest, to the base of a tree, or to an empty building, and considers in this way: do I have an obsession which has not been abandoned, which can obsess my mind such that I will be unable to accurately know and see? Did you get that? So do I have any obsession which prevents me from clearly seeing the true nature of reality? Monks, if a monk is obsessed with sensual passion, then his mind is obsessed. So just thinking, anytime you're sitting there thinking like, oh, I could really go for some ice cream right now. What is that? It's sensual passion. You're obsessed with desire for sensuality. And when you're obsessed with the desire for sensuality, your mind is not leaning towards renunciation. It's not leaning towards equanimity. It's not leaning towards wisdom. It's just obsessed with the delusional idea that a particular sensory experience will make you happy. Has anybody here ever had a sensory experience which was absolutely 100% perfectly amazing? Anyone? No? I've had some that were like 95%, which was pretty good. But still, nothing 100%. And even the 95%ers all ended. It's all gone. So that's the nature of all sensory experience. It is incapable of bringing perfect happiness. It can only ever bring temporary, limited pleasure. So as long as we're obsessed with such things, then we will not be seeking for unconditional, unlimited, perfect happiness, which can only be obtained through renunciation and non-attachment. Another way you could talk about Buddhism is that ultimately it's all about non-attachment. It's all about letting go. It's about renunciation. Because when you let go of everything, then you discover that you don't need anything in order to be happy. And in fact, it's the constant seeking after things that has kept you so unhappy for so long. Monks, if a monk is obsessed with aversion, then his mind is obsessed. So thinking about all the times when you are caught up in how much you hate something or dislike something or want something to stop or end or go away. The mind is obsessed with aversion. What's that like? Is the mind bright, spacious, wise, and joyful at that time? No, of course not. Of course not. When the mind is obsessed with aversion, it's the opposite of enlightened. It's like being immersed in a burning fire. It's not even remotely close to pleasant. And the mind feels extremely constricted. This is also the case with sensual obsession. When the mind is obsessed with sensual desire, it also feels extremely constricted. There's that feeling of like, I need that. There's that feeling of constriction. Things must be a particular way. And also with aversion, the mind becomes constricted. I hate that. And so the mind is caught in a particular way of experiencing reality. So it's not open to the vastness of reality. It's caught in one little fragment of it. Monks, if a monk is obsessed with lethargy and languor, then his mind is obsessed. So when you're feeling really sleepy and dull-minded, are you able to perfect wisdom at that time? Is the mind sharp, bright, clear, and joyful? No? No, of course not. If a monk is obsessed with restlessness and remorse, then his mind is obsessed. Similarly, when the mind is very agitated and all over the place, is there clarity, wisdom, and joy? Definitely not. If a monk is obsessed with doubt, then his mind is obsessed. So one element of Buddhist practice is that you need to actually sincerely do the practices in order to see whether or not they work. So if we're just sitting here thinking like, I'm not really sure this works, I'm not really sure I should be doing this, maybe this isn't really the right path, well then you won't ever actually find out if anything works. But if you take a period of time and you really devote your mind to the meditation practice, then you can start to see results. And the doubt will evaporate on its own through direct experience. So did anybody here feel even a little bit calmer, happier, or more focused at the end of the meditation period? Even a little bit? Great. So then your doubt has evaporated to that extent, because now you know through personal experience that this practice has some benefit, that it works to one extent or another. So through experience, doubt evaporates. But if we just mire ourselves in skeptical vacillation, then we'll never know. We'll just be lost. We'll just be obsessed in that skeptical thinking without ever trying it out for ourselves and seeing what happens. Monks, if a monk is intent upon this world, then his mind is obsessed. Monks, if a monk is intent upon the next world, then his mind is obsessed. So these two come as a pair. So intent upon this world, so like obsessed with getting particular gains or status or achievements in this life. Like, it's my goal to be the CEO of my company. Well, I mean, that's nice. It's not going to help you attain enlightenment. And if that's what you want to do, okay, I guess. I mean, you're wasting your time. But I suppose it's not the worst thing you could be doing. Or an obsession with going places or doing things that have nothing to do with renunciation, that have nothing to do with non-attachment, that have nothing to do with cultivating spiritual qualities. So those obsessions just distract us from the path. So whatever it is you think you want in this life, it's just a distraction from the spiritual path. The only thing that's really worth focusing on is cultivating a mind of boundless joy and wisdom. Why would we settle for anything less than the best? It's like I could give you a piece of candy today or a piece of gold tomorrow. What do you want? Do you want the candy? Good. Skip the candy. It's not worth it. Don't settle for the pretty things of the world. They're not worth it. If a monk is intent upon the next world, then his mind is obsessed. So that's the obsession with wanting a particular kind of rebirth. Like wanting to be reborn as an angel or a goddess, or wanting to be reborn as a mind-only being, or wanting to be reborn as a, if your sights are set really low, maybe you just want to be reborn as a particularly wealthy, beautiful human. I mean, boring. If you're aiming at rebirth, at least aim for something high up. Aim for some kind of deva birth. But even that, again, it's pointless. Because it's just another temporary state of being which eventually comes to an end. We've already experienced every possible state of being. And it clearly was not satisfying because here we are again. So aiming at a heavenly rebirth, you're just wasting your time. You're just delaying the inevitable. You're not really achieving anything useful. Then the Buddha says, monks, if a monk is engaged in disputes, arguments, contentions, and mutual verbal assault, then his mind is obsessed. So he's just bringing it full circle. He's like, okay, let's face it, guys. If you're just thinking like, well, I'm right and they're wrong, well, are you actually going to make any progress on the spiritual path? If you're just obsessed with your argument, you're obsessed with trying to prove that you're right and that they're wrong, obsessed with pointing out how much better you are than they are, is that really going to help you on the path towards liberation? Of course not. So he's trying to remind these particular monks that there's a higher goal. He's reminding them to keep their sights set on full enlightenment, to keep their sights set on awakening, to remember that there's something far more valuable than winning the argument. There's something far more valuable than the lesser goals that we so easily get caught up in. So the Buddha says, one understands there is no obsession in me which has not been abandoned, which could obsess my mind such that I would be unable to accurately know and see. My mind is well directed for awakening to the truth. This is the first knowledge that one has attained, which is noble, transcendent, and not in common with ordinary people. So this is the first factor of a stream enterer. A stream enterer's mind is not obsessed with sensual desire, aversion, lethargy, restlessness, skepticism, attaining any particular status or experience in this world, attaining any particular rebirth in the next world, and they're not caught up in pointless arguments. They're not getting caught in disputes. So, does anybody qualify for all of those? No? I didn't think so. So we have no stream enterers in the room. That's fine. Are we trying? Anybody trying? Few people? Okay, that's good. The next one, the Buddha says, monks, this is another one. A noble disciple considers in this way. When I pursue, develop, and commit to this perspective, do I personally acquire tranquility and peacefulness? He understands. When I pursue, develop, and commit to this perspective, I personally acquire tranquility and peacefulness. This is the second knowledge that he has attained, which is noble, transcendent, and not in common with ordinary people. So when we reflect upon this way of seeing the world, so this Buddhist way of reflecting on the world, how does the mind move? So many people, when I talk about these things, they actually get kind of disturbed or a little bit freaked out, or they just space out. It's not interesting to them. So the tendency tends to be either disinterest or aversion. But if instead your mind, you find this delightful, you find this talk of awakening delightful, and the mind naturally tends towards tranquility, well, that's a good sign. That's a sign that you're on the right track. Monks, this is another one. A noble disciple considers in this way. Are there contemplatives and priests outside of this teaching who have the same kind of perspective as I do? He understands there are no contemplatives and priests outside of this teaching who have the same kind of perspective as I do. This is the third knowledge that he has attained, which is noble, transcendent, and not in common with ordinary people. So what this is pointing to is that the attainment of stream entry, this first stage of enlightenment, it depends upon an understanding of a few basic perspectives, which are not common in the world. First off, it depends upon the awareness that everything is impermanent and the awareness that everything is impersonal. And that already is a huge step away from the vast majority of worldviews that one will encounter. The vast majority of worldviews are based upon self. They're based upon the idea of an eternal soul or an essential essence of being. And most perspectives which do not have a concept of soul are materialist perspectives. So they reject the idea of karma and rebirth. So Buddhism is one of the extremely rare worldviews which has both the idea of karma and rebirth and also the idea that there is no such thing as an eternal soul. The idea that every single component of our experience is impersonal and subject to change. So these things together are what lead towards awakening. It's what leads towards stream entry and the stages of awakening beyond that. So these are not things that are commonly found elsewhere. So most spiritual systems are built upon an idea of self-realization or self-development. Well, Buddhism is not. Buddhism is based upon the realization there is no self and the development of the perspective that there is no self. This is quite a bit different. Monks, this is another one. A noble disciple considers in this way: do I have the disposition of a person who has attained right perspective? And monks, what is the disposition of a person who has attained right perspective? If he commits an offense for which rehabilitation is possible, then he quickly tells, discloses, and clarifies it to the teacher or to wise co-practitioners. And after telling, disclosing, and clarifying it, he is restrained in the future. Monks, just as a young, undeveloped infant that touches a hot coal with its hand or foot quickly withdraws, in the same way, monks, this is the disposition of a person who has attained right perspective. So this is another factor of a stream enterer. So they might still do some minor errors. They might still do things that are a little bit inappropriate. So they won't do grossly terrible things. Like a stream enterer is not likely to commit murder, but they might accidentally hurt someone, or they might accidentally offend someone, or something of that sort. But if they do so, then they will recognize that what they did was inappropriate. They will apologize for it, and commit not to do it again. So they'll openly acknowledge, yeah, I screwed up. I did something inappropriate, but I'm not going to do it again. I'm going to do my best to be restrained in the future. So I particularly like the image he uses of like somebody touching a hot coal or a hot stove. They quickly pull back. So in the same way, a stream enterer who touches misconduct, who touches harmful or offensive behavior, they naturally pull back from it because they recognize that it burns. There's a clear awareness that unvirtuous conduct, so harmful behavior, is antithetical to the awakened mind. So they naturally pull back very easily. One understands, I have the disposition of a person who has attained right perspective. This is the fourth knowledge. Monks, this is another one. A noble disciple considers in this way: do I have the disposition of a person who has attained right perspective? This is the disposition of a person who has attained right perspective. One makes an effort to do whatever needs to be done for one's co-practitioners, while still having a strong commitment to training oneself in heightened virtue, heightened mentality, and heightened wisdom. Just as a cow with a young calf watches the calf while grazing. In the same way, monks, this is the disposition of a person who has attained right perspective. One makes an effort to do whatever needs to be done for one's co-practitioners, while still having a strong commitment to training oneself in heightened virtue, heightened mentality, and heightened wisdom. So it's recognizing that there are things that need to be done. So if you're a layperson, you need to make a living one way or another. So you need to go to work so that you can get food and pay your rent. And if you're living in a monastery, then there's always chores to be done. The meditation hall needs to be swept. The garden needs to be tended to. And there's always something that needs to be done. So when something needs to be done to support ourselves and our companions, then we do it. But we never forget our higher purpose. We never forget our commitment to spiritual practice. We never forget that the activity we're doing is important only because it supports the necessities of life, which allow us to practice, which allow us to continue. And even as we're doing that practice, we continue to focus the mind on mindfulness, equanimity, concentration, loving kindness. So always keeping the mind pointed in the direction of awakening. Monks, this is another one. A noble disciple considers in this way: Do I have the strength of a person who has attained right perspective? And monks, what is the strength of a person who has attained right perspective? Monks, this is the strength of a person who has attained right perspective. When the Dhamma Vinaya, which has been declared by the Tathagata, is being taught, he listens to the Dhamma carefully, attentively, and wholeheartedly. So, in other words, when the Buddha's teachings are being taught, one pays full attention because one recognizes that this is something incredibly valuable. It's something which is really worth making a sincere, dedicated effort to understand, because this is what leads to true happiness. So it's something which is absolutely fascinating. It's absolutely enthralling to the mind of one who is firmly on the path. So that means when someone's giving a Dhamma talk, you're not spacing out, you're not drifting off, you're not taking a nap in the corner, you're not thinking about where you're going for dinner afterwards, you're not thinking about what you're doing with your friends tomorrow evening. You're just completely riveted on paying attention to the Buddha's words, trying to understand them, and applying them to your own mind. That's what's most enthralling to a stream enterer. One understands, I have the strength of a person who has attained right perspective. This is the sixth knowledge that one has attained, which is noble, transcendent, and not in common with ordinary people. Monks, this is another one. A noble disciple considers in this way, do I have the strength of a person who has attained right perspective? And monks, what is the strength of a person who has attained right perspective? When the Dhamma Vinaya, which has been declared by the Tathagata, is being taught, one acquires an understanding of its meaning, one acquires an understanding of the Dhamma, and one acquires joy connected with the Dhamma. So in other words, when you hear the teachings which lead to awakening, when you hear the teachings of the Buddha, then you understand what it's aiming at. You understand its purpose. You understand what it leads towards. And that brings joy. Again, I've had times when I was talking about the Buddha's teachings to people who are firmly mired in the world, so people who are hardcore sensualists. And they would actually get irritated. They'd get irritated about hearing about things like renunciation. It wouldn't make any sense to them. It's like, renunciation? Why? That doesn't make any sense. Why would you not chase after every opportunity to engage in sensual pleasure? Why wouldn't you? That's just strange. And they might even get irritated that I would consider such a thing valuable or important. Irritated that it's something which is one of the core values of a major world religion. But on the other hand, one who is firmly on the path, when one hears about the practices which lead towards awakening, one feels the truth of it. One feels the value of it. And one delights in knowing that one has at one's fingertips the transcendent. The one is standing at the gates of the deathless, as the Buddha says elsewhere. That's something to delight in, something to find joy in. So one understands, I have the strength of a person who has attained right perspective. This is the seventh knowledge that one has attained, which is noble, transcendent, and not in common with ordinary people. Monks, when a noble disciple has these 7 characteristics, he has sought out well the disposition that leads to realizing the attainment of stream entry. Monks, when a noble disciple has these 7 characteristics, one has attained stream entry. This is what the Blessed One said. Satisfied, those monks delighted in the Blessed One's speech. Okay, so that's the discourse. Any questions or comments? Anybody feeling joy connected with the Dhamma? A few people? Okay. Any questions? Yes.
Sort of comment on the question, but maybe it's because of the context in which the Buddha was delivering that sutta, or those words rather. But he was really speaking to a group of fellow practitioners. So there was sort of a shared just think those, I'm sure the Buddha, and I know actually that he thinks those attitudes should be developed with respect to everyone. Because there's that other sutta where he talks about, like, if someone's chopping you up, you should still cultivate metta toward those people too.
Mm.
I'm sure. But I think it's just much harder to do that when there isn't that common shared set of underlying values. You know, like I think even in today's political discourse, it's much harder to cultivate those perspectives when you don't even share the same kind of underlying ideas about the world at all.
So what you're saying is you want to live in a monastery? Is that what you're saying?
Maybe.
Yeah.
No,
That sounds like a great idea. I say go for it. Yeah, it is more difficult. There's another sutta where the Buddha said, having good spiritual companions is the entirety of the holy life. So it's really worth considering. Who are our companions? Who are we spending time with? And how does it affect us? So if you spend all your time hanging out with people whose highest values are beer and television, well, that's not necessarily the best influences. And so naturally you're going to have some difficulty doing these practices. But if instead you spend your time hanging out with fellow practitioners, it's going to be a lot easier. You still have to deal with your own mind, which is the hardest part, but at least you'll have some external support. But yeah, the other thing here is that we're very good at finding excuses to not practice. Because Buddhist practice runs directly counter to what we're used to doing. So especially in the beginning, it's very difficult. Because we have all this momentum going in one direction, and we're trying to turn it around. So we're facing some extremely strong inertia. It's not easy. But once you start to turn around, once you start to get some momentum going in the right direction, it starts to get easier. And it just keeps getting easier. Okay. To a large extent, what we're doing in the early stages of practice is just setting the conditions to be able to practice. The real serious practice comes a bit later. In the beginning, we're just trying to set up the conditions to be able to practice well. So a big part of that actually is who we spend our time with, what we do with our time, where we go, where we live, what we prioritize. Then later on you can deal with things like attaining jhana and developing insight into the emptiness of all phenomena and so on. But without that foundation, it's really hard to get to the heights of mental achievement. Okay. So it's not to say you can't practice living an ordinary, distracted, scattered lay life. Of course you can. And of course you'll get some benefit from it too. And those benefits will be experienceable both in this life and in future lives. But there's something much higher, which is possible if we're willing to make the effort. So personally, I'm aiming for the best. I'm not going to settle for less than the best. Anything else? I know I come across as uncompromising at times, and there's a good reason for that. It's because we're so incredibly good at compromising. So it's really important to start to work against that tendency to sell ourselves short, because we do it all the time. We're always selling ourselves short. And we have the potential to be so much more. We have the potential to become a fully enlightened being. We have the potential to become equal to the Buddha. We have the potential to become Buddhas ourselves. Why would we shoot for anything less? So if we compromise on our values, then we'll never get to that height. But if we're willing to be relentless and uncompromising in our practice, then we can make progress extremely quickly. And we can reach the highest. We can attain enlightenment. It is possible if we make the effort. Of course, it's not going to be easy, or else we would have done it by now. But it can be done. So it's worth trying to do. Okay, anything else?